Control your son, sir. This is not a dance hall. Mr. Harrison's sharp hiss cut through the opulent silence of Kingsley's each word, a shard of ice. All eyes cold appraising darted towards little Leo Sinclair, his legs encased in gleaming metal braces, his small hand still bravely outstretched towards Grace Evans, the restaurant's only black waitress. Her shift had in fact just concluded. Yet as she faced Leo's billionaire father, Edward Sinclair, her calm gaze met his icy disapproval with a quiet strength that was a defiance all its own, a silent challenge to the rigid world around them. How does a man who commands empires react when his carefully constructed universe is threatened by his own child's innocent desire and the unexpected courage of a woman who has nothing to lose but her dignity, if you believe that a single heartfelt gesture can send ripples through the most fortified of lives? Subscribe and share your thoughts below on what happens when true human connection dares to interrupt a billionaire's perfectly ordered world. Edward Sinclair moved through the world encased in a fortress of his own making. Its walls were built of billion-dollar deals, its ramparts fortified by a reputation for icy control, and its vast, echoing halls were filled with the silence of unspoken grief. Tonight, that fortress had extended its perimeter to encompass a corner table at Kingsley's Manhattan's most ostentatiously exclusive restaurant. The clink of his son's cutlery against porcelain sounded unnaturally loud in the cathedral-like hush, each scrape a small, sharp accusation against the velvet-draped silence Edward paid so handsomely to maintain. He watched Leo, his 10-year-old son, struggle with the microscopic portion of seared scallop that lay isolated on the vast expanse of his plate. Leo's small hand, usually so deft with his intricate Lego creations, trembled slightly as he maneuvered the fork. Metal braces gleaming dully under the muted chandelier light encased his thin legs, a constant visible reminder of the accident that had shattered their world 2 years prior, the same accident that had stolen Eleanor, his wife, his vibrant, life-affirming Eleanor. A familiar coldness tightened Edward's chest. After Eleanor, control had become his only refuge. Control over his empire, control over his emotions, and a suffocating, misguided control over Leo, all in the name of protecting him from a world that had already proven its cruelty. He'd convinced himself that shielding Leo from every possible risk, every potential disappointment was the highest form of love. He hadn't realized he was merely constructing a gilded cage around the boy, and perhaps one around himself, too. Leo looked up, his brow furrowed. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air. "Is this food for giants who aren't very hungry?" Edward's lips thinned. He was about to offer a clipped, didactic response about haute cuisine when Mr. Harrison, the restaurant's manager, materialized beside their table, his posture a study in obsequious precision. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" Mr. Sinclair Harrison's voice was a low, reverent hum, his eyes flicking nervously towards Leo, then back to Edward, assessing, always assessing. Edward had seen the type 1,000 times, men who mistook wealth for godhood and offered fealty accordingly. It was a tiresome, predictable dance. Perfectly adequate, Harrison Edward replied, his tone dismissing the man before the words had fully left his mouth. He'd hoped this rare public dinner, their first in almost a year, might offer Leo a glimpse of something. Normalcy, perhaps. Though what was normal for a boy who lived in a mansion, staffed by people who addressed him as Master Leo, and whose primary companion was a rotating roster of highly paid, overly cautious therapists. He remembered Eleanor's laughter, how it used to fill every room, how she'd insisted on picnics in Central Park, sticky fingers and grass stains be damned. "They need to live, Edward," she'd chided him gently even then, when his protective instincts had been merely a shadow of the monolith they'd become. Not just exist in a bubble. The memory was a sharp pang, a fleeting warmth quickly doused by the present chill. The live pianist, tucked away in a discreet alcove, began a soft, melancholic melody. Leo, who usually retreated into a world of his own in such opulent, adult-dominated spaces, suddenly straightened. His gaze, usually downcast, darted across the room, landing on a waitress, moving with quiet efficiency between tables. Grace Evans. Her name tag was simple, unadorned. She was the only black server in this section of the restaurant, an island of calm professionalism in a sea of Staratlno-orchestrated formality. Leo's small hand, the one that had trembled with the scallop, clenched. He took a breath, a tiny, determined sound. Then, to Edward's utter astonishment, Leo began to push his chair back. The screech of its legs against the polished marble floor was a minor explosion in the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. Leo Edward began his voice, low a warning. "What are you doing?" But Leo wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Grace Evans. She was clearing a nearby table, her movements economical and graceful. As if sensing his gaze, she glanced up. For a fleeting second, her eyes met Leo's, and then almost imperceptibly flickered towards Edward. A flicker so brief, so unreadable, it might have been a trick of the light. But Edward, a man whose fortune was built on reading the unreadable, felt a strange, unidentifiable current pass through him. Did she know him? Unlikely. Yet, before Edward could interject further, Leo was on his feet, his braces, a stark, metallic reality, against the plush old-world carpet. He took a hesitant step, then another, moving towards Grace Evans. Conversation at the surrounding tables, already a muted murmur, seemed to die away. All eyes, it felt, were on his son. "Sir, control your son." Mr. Harrison was back, his earlier obsequiousness replaced by a mask of barely concealed panic. His voice, though still attempting a whisper, was sharp enough to cut glass. That's highly inappropriate. This is Kingsley's not a playground." He looked at Edward, expecting no demanding intervention. The unspoken message was clear. "Your child is disturbing our very important clientele." Edward felt a familiar surge of irritation mixed with a deeper, more unsettling embarrassment. This was precisely why he avoided such public outings. Leo, usually so withdrawn, was now the center of unwanted attention, his vulnerability on full display. "Leo, sit down." Now Edward commanded his voice colder than he intended, the old reflex of control kicking in hard. Leo stopped, his small shoulders slumping. His hand, which had been halfway outstretched, dropped to his side. The light in his eyes, so briefly ignited, seemed to dim. Grace Evans had finished clearing her table. She straightened up, holding a tray laden with crystal and silver. Her gaze moved from a visibly flustered Mr. Harrison to Edward's stony expression, and finally to Leo, whose disappointment was a palpable thing in the suddenly very quiet room. She was, Edward noted with a detached part of his mind, remarkably composed. Mr. Harrison Grace said, her voice calm, clear, and carrying just enough to be heard without being disruptive. "My shift just ended, actually." She placed her tray neatly on a nearby serving stand. Then, to everyone's profound surprise, particularly Edward's, she turned to Leo. A small, almost unnoticeable smile touched the corners of her lips. "I believe someone was about to ask me something." Leo's head snapped up. A spark of disbelief. Then a hesitant, hopeful light re-entered his eyes. He looked from Grace to his father, then back to Grace, a silent question in his gaze. Mr. Harrison looked as though he might spontaneously combust. "Miss Evans, this is hardly the time or place." But Grace simply held Leo's gaze, a gentle invitation in her own. The world seemed to hold its breath. Edward felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He should stop this. He should assert his authority, remove Leo from the situation, apologize for the disturbance. It was what was expected. It was what he always did. Leo took another shaky step, then another, until he stood directly before her. He swallowed his small Adam's apple bobbing. Then, in a voice that was surprisingly clear, if a little breathless, he said, "Miss Evans, would you like to dance with me?" The silence that followed was absolute. Edward could hear the blood pounding in his ears. This was a disaster, a public spectacle. But Grace Evans didn't laugh. She didn't look flustered. She didn't even glance at Edward for permission or at Mr. Harrison for guidance. Her focus was entirely on the small, determined boy before her. She inclined her head slightly. "It would be my honor, Leo," she said softly. "But I can't very well dance in this apron, can I?" And with a smooth, unhurried movement, she untied the crisp white apron, folded it neatly, and placed it beside her tray. Her earlier declaration about her shift ending, now taking on a definitive, unarguable finality. The defiance was quiet, unstated, yet utterly resolute. And it was aimed not just at a fuming restaurant manager, but Edward felt with a startling jolt squarely at him. The restaurant, a moment before a symphony of discreet, clinking and hushed tones, was now utterly silent. Even the distant pianist seemed to have faltered the melody, hanging unfinished in the air. Mr. Harrison's face, a polite mask moments ago, had morphed into a rictus of disbelief and suppressed outrage. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a goldfish gasping in an invisible bowl. Edward Sinclair watched a strange detachment settling over him. Part of him, the CEO accustomed to seamless control, registered the social disruption, the breach of decorum. Another older part, a part he thought long dormant, felt something else. A stirring, an unwelcome, unfamiliar resonance. Grace Evans, now apronless, her simple black dress accentuating her quiet dignity, turned her full attention back to Leo. The boy, buoyed by her acceptance, seemed to grow an inch taller, though his braces still gleamed with a painful vulnerability. "All right, Leo Sinclair," Grace said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the room's stunned silence. "Since you did the asking, you get to lead." Leo's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic warring with pride. "Led." He echoed his voice a little squeak. He glanced down at his legs, then back at Grace. "But I'm not very good. I mostly shuffle." He offered a self-deprecating smile that tugged at something deep within Edward. Grace's smile widened, warm and genuine. "Leo," she said, her tone gentle, but firm. Dancing isn't about being good. It's about feeling the music. And sometimes she leaned in a little, as if sharing a secret. The best dances are the ones with a little creative shuffling. "Besides," she added with a playful wink that Leo shyly returned, "these fancy floors have seen worse, I promise." She extended her hand. Leo hesitated for only a breath before his small hand, the one that still sometimes struggled with buttons, found hers. It was a small point of contact, yet it felt to Edward like the closing of a circuit, an energy beginning to flow, where before there had only been a void. And then they began. If one could call it dancing. Leo, bless his determined heart, took a step. His left foot dragging slightly scraped against the polished marble, the sound of metal on stone, a jarring note in the silent room. He winced, but Grace didn't. She didn't hurry him, didn't correct him, didn't try to steer him. She simply followed. Her body adjusted to his hesitant rhythm, her grace accommodating his lack of it. It was a strange, poignant sight, the tall, composed woman moving with an almost liquid ease, her movements dictated entirely by the faltering, uneven cadence of a 10-year-old boy in leg braces. "She's getting fired tomorrow," a woman at the next table whispered, loud enough for Edward to hear. He ignored her, his gaze fixed on his son. Leo took another step, then a third. A tiny bead of sweat trickled down his temple, but his face was alight with an intense concentration Edward hadn't seen in years. Not the strained focus of therapy sessions, nor the pained endurance of medical examinations. This was different. This was joy. A fragile, hard-won joy. And as he watched, a memory, sharp and bittersweet, pierced through Edward's carefully constructed defenses. Eleanor in their sun-drenched living room, years ago before the shadows had fallen. Leo was a toddler then, his chubby legs unsteady but fearless. Eleanor had him by the hands, spinning him around, both of them, laughing, the air filled with a light, effortless happiness. "It's not about perfection, Edward," she'd called out to him, her eyes sparkling, as he'd stood in the doorway, a hesitant smile on his own face. "It's about connection. Just connect. Connection." The word echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. When was the last time he had truly connected with Leo, not as a patient, to be managed, a problem to be solved, or a legacy to be protected, but simply as his son? The answer shamed him. Grace followed Leo's clumsy, courageous steps. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply was. Present, attentive. Her quiet strength seemed to envelop Leo, creating a small, safe space in the midst of the watching, judging world. And in that space, something within Leo shifted. The fear in his eyes receded, replaced by a shy, burgeoning pride. He was leading. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't being guided, helped, or corrected. He was leading. The dance, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps a minute. 3, maybe 4, halting circuits in the small space between tables. To Edward it felt like an eternity, a moment stretched taut with unspoken emotions. Then, as if by some mutual unspoken agreement, they stopped. Leo was breathing heavily, his face flushed, but his eyes shone with an incandescent triumph. Grace gently released his hand. "Thank you for asking me out, Leo," she said, her voice as formal and respectful as if she were addressing a grown man. It was an honor. Leo beamed a wide, uninhibited smile that reached his eyes and transformed his small face. "Thank you, Miss Evans." He managed his voice, still a little shaky. It was then that Mr. Harrison, who had been hovering like a thundercloud, seemed to regain his voice, if not his composure. "Miss Evans," he hissed, stepping forward, his face mottled with fury. "I believe your services are no longer required. Anywhere. Ever. This kind of spectacle. That's enough, Harrison." The words were out of Edward's mouth before he'd consciously willed them. They were quiet, almost dangerously so, but they sliced through Mr. Harrison's tirade like a scalpel. The manager froze, his mouth agape. Every head in the vicinity, already turned in their direction, seemed to swivel further. Edward rose slowly from his chair. He felt different, unsettled. The carefully ordered world he inhabited had been disturbed by a 10-year-old boy and a waitress who dared to value connection over convention. Grace Evans met his gaze, her own calm and unreadable. There was no fear there, no apology, only a quiet self-possession that Edward, a connoisseur of power in all its forms, found strangely compelling. He ignored Mr. Harrison, who now looked thoroughly terrified. Edward addressed Grace directly. "Wait," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried in the renewed silence. He felt the weight of every stare in the room, the unspoken questions, the morbid curiosity. He was Richard Sinclair. His displeasure could end careers. His favor could make them. What would he do? He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a slim platinum card case. Extracting a card, he held it out to her. "My office. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Grace accepted the card, her expression unchanging, though Edward thought he detected the slightest tremor in her hand as her fingers brushed his. She didn't offer thanks, didn't ask why. She simply nodded once, a brief acknowledging tilt of her head, then turned and walked away, moving with the same unhurried grace she'd displayed all evening. She didn't look back. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale at once. Mr. Harrison looked as though he might faint. Edward sat back down the card case, suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. He looked at his son. Leo was staring at him, his earlier elation now tinged with confusion. And something else. An unspoken question that felt like an accusation. Dad Leo finally whispered his voice, small but piercing in the lingering silence. "Why did you do that?" Why indeed Edward looked at his son truly, looked at him perhaps for the first time in 2 long, desolate years. And for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he saw not just the fragile child Eleanor had left in his care, but a complete human being, a boy with a brave, yearning heart, whose simplest, most profound needs he had systematically, unthinkingly ignored. The realization was a cold, hard fist clenching around his own heart. He had no answer for his son. Not yet. The lobby of Sinclair Tower the next morning was a cathedral of commerce, all gleaming, marble soaring glass, and the hushed, reverent footsteps of people who understood the silent language of power. Grace Evans, in her best navy blue skirt and a white blouse she'd carefully ironed the night before, an outfit that probably cost less than the silk tie of the man who'd just brushed past her, felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into an eagle's eyrie. Yet as she approached the imposing onyx reception desk, her posture was straight, her gaze steady. She clutched her worn purse a little tighter, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, unyielding self-possession. Grace Evans to see Mr. Sinclair. She stated her voice, calm despite the flutter in her chest. The receptionist, a woman whose perfectly sculpted expression revealed nothing, examined Grace with a cool, appraising glance that lingered a fraction too long on her sensible shoes. After a brief, muted call, she directed Grace to the executive elevators. 80th floor. Miss Coleman will meet you. The elevator ascended with a silent, stomach-dropping velocity. Grace took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here. It wasn't for a job, not in the way Edward Sinclair likely imagined. It was for Leo. And for all the other Leos whose potential was too often dismissed or misunderstood. Ms. Coleman, Edward Sinclair's executive assistant, was precisely what Grace had expected, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of hyper-efficient, no-nonsense authority. Her smile was brief, professional, and held no discernible warmth. "Miss Evans," she said, her voice crisp. "Mr. Sinclair is expecting you. This way, please." Grace followed her through a hushed labyrinth of corridors, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The air itself seemed to hum with a low thrum of immense wealth and influence. Employees they passed, dressed in expensive, understated attire, cast curious, fleeting glances. A black woman dressed as plainly as Grace was being personally escorted to Edward Sinclair's inner sanctum was clearly an anomaly. Grace registered their curiosity, but didn't let it unsettle her. She'd faced far worse than curious stares. Ms. Coleman paused before a set of imposing double doors. "Mr. Sinclair is on a brief call. He'll be with you momentarily." She gestured towards a seating area that looked more like a museum exhibit than a waiting room. As Grace sat, Miss Coleman remained standing, her posture unwavering. After a beat of silence, she asked, her voice a shade too casual. "So the restaurant, Kingsley's. You enjoyed your interaction there last night." The slight emphasis on interaction was not lost on Grace. It was a subtle probe, a test. Grace met her gaze evenly. It was an eventful evening. Miss Coleman's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. Indeed, Mr. Sinclair doesn't often deviate from his schedule. One might have thought from her tone that Edward Sinclair inviting a waitress to his office was akin to a minor celestial body falling out of orbit. Grace merely nodded, offering no further information, a small private smile playing on her lips as she imagined Miss Coleman's reaction if she knew Grace worked 2 other jobs besides the restaurant. The thought, this powerful, impeccably dressed woman's likely inability to comprehend such a reality, was a fleeting internal moment of slightly absurd humor for Grace. The intercom on Miss Coleman's desk buzzed discreetly. "He'll see you now, Miss Evans." Edward Sinclair's office was less an office and more a panoramic vista of New York City, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread out below them, a vast, glittering carpet of ambition and dreams. Edward stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the breathtaking skyline. He looked Grace, thought like a king surveying his domain. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice steady. He turned his face, a mask of controlled neutrality. If he was surprised by her composure or by her presence in his rarefied world, he gave no sign. "Miss Evans, thank you for coming. Please." He gestured towards a leather chair that probably cost more than her annual rent for all 3 of her jobs combined. The silence that followed was calculated, a tactic Grace recognized from countless observations. The kind of silence designed to make the less powerful party nervous, to make them talk too much, reveal too much. She waited, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice smooth, devoid of the previous night's slight edge. "I confess Miss Evans last night was unexpected. My son, Leo, he hasn't shown such an initiative in a very long time." "Leo is a remarkable boy," Grace said simply. Edward nodded, a curt, almost dismissive gesture. "He is, and he requires specialized care. Which brings me to you. I've had my team do some preliminary research." He gestured vaguely towards a sleek, minimalist desk. "Grace Evans, bachelor's degree in child development from NYU, currently pursuing a master's in special education, though it appears to be on hold. You co-founded a small community program some years ago. Freedom Steps. I believe it's called for children with physical disabilities. Currently," he paused, his eyes flicking over some unseen notes facing significant funding challenges. Grace felt a familiar tightening in her chest at the mention of Freedom Steps' struggles, but her expression remained serene. Of course he would know all that. Men like Edward Sinclair had resources that could unearth the Dead Sea Scrolls in an afternoon, if they so chose. "That's all correct, Mr. Sinclair." And yet Edward continued, his gaze sharpening. "You work as a waitress. And I understand at a bookstore on weekends. And as a tutor, when you can find students, I do what's necessary." "Mr. Sinclair," Grace replied, a hint of steel now underlying her calm tone. Edward leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I admire tenacity, Miss Evans, and your clear affection for my son was evident, as was his for you." He paused. "I want you to work for me, for Leo, as a full-time therapeutic companion. Name your price." Within reason, of course, he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, as if reason, for him, was a concept far removed from her own. He might have suggested she simply host a small charity gala at the Plaza. Grace thought with a flash of dry humor, so vast was the chasm between their financial realities. If he had, she might have dryly replied, Mr. Sinclair, our current fundraising record for Freedom Steps is a bake sale that made $78.50, and we were thrilled. But she kept that thought to herself. This wasn't the time for levity, however tempting. Mr. Sinclair, she began her voice, even I appreciate the offer. And I am deeply fond of Leo. He has a spirit that... She trailed off, searching for the right word that shines. Indeed, Edward said a flicker of something unreadable, pride-pain, in his eyes. Which is why I'm prepared to offer you a package that would triple, perhaps quadruple, what you are currently cobbling together from your various endeavors. You would have access to all our resources, work alongside his current team of specialists. Your sole focus would be Leo. It was a lifeline, a golden, glittering lifeline that could solve all her financial worries, that could pour desperately needed funds into Freedom Steps, that could allow her to finish her masters. All she had to do was say yes. But the image of Leo's face, last night alight with the joy of leading, flashed in her mind, and the memory of Edward's cold command. Leo, sit down. Now, Grace took a slow breath. The mini-climax of their interaction was upon them. Mr. Sinclair, she said, her voice soft, but infused with an unshakable resolve. With all due respect, I must decline your offer. Edward Sinclair stared at Grace Evans, the word decline echoing in the opulent silence of his office. It was not a word he heard often, particularly when attached to an offer of such magnitude. Miss. Coleman, who had remained a silent, statuesque witness by the door, allowed a flicker of something, surprise, disbelief, to cross her impeccably composed features before quickly schooling them back into neutrality. You decline. Edward repeated his voice, dangerously soft. He prided himself on his inscrutability, but for a moment genuine astonishment almost breached his defenses. Grace met his gaze without flinching. Respectfully, yes, Mr. Sinclair. She then did something even more unexpected. She reached into her worn purse, the same one she'd clutched so tightly in the lobby, and retrieved a slightly creased, homemade-looking flyer. She placed it gently on the polished expanse of his mahogany desk. It depicted a vibrant, if somewhat crudely drawn, group of children of varying abilities, all seemingly in motion under the words, Freedom Steps. This is where I believe I can best help Leo, she said. And children like him. We have classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4. The first one is always free. If you'd like to bring him, you're both welcome. Before Edward could formulate a response to this audacious counter-proposal, an invitation from a waitress to a billionaire to bring his son to what looked like a small-time community program, Grace Evans had stood, offered a polite nod, and walked out of his office, leaving Ms. Coleman looking as though she'd just witnessed a pigeon confidently redesigning the company logo. The following Tuesday, Edward found himself in a part of the city his limousine usually bypassed at speed. The address on the flyer led them to an old warehouse, its brick facade softened by a surprisingly vibrant mural of dancing figures. Leo beside him in the back seat was practically vibrating with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Edward himself felt dislocated. This was a far cry from the gleaming towers and hushed clinics he was accustomed to. Are you sure this is the place? Dad, Leo asked, peering out the tinted window. It doesn't look very medical. Edward grunted, non-committally. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. Grace Evans had unsettled him, her quiet refusal, a pebble dropped into the still deep waters of his meticulously ordered life, the ripples still spreading. He'd come today out of a reluctant curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of something he refused to name, a desperate, unacknowledged hope that she might possess something his army of renowned specialists had missed. As they entered the cavernous space, surprised him. It was clean bright despite its industrial bones, and filled with a cheerful creative chaos. Handmade posters with slogans like "Your rhythm, your rules, and every move" counts adorned the walls. Music played, not the subdued classical of Kingsley's, but something upbeat, rhythmic, infectious. And children. Children were everywhere, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers or braces, similar to Leo's, a few with no visible aids at all moving, exploring, some laughing, some intensely focused. A young woman with a bright, energetic smile and eyes strikingly similar to Grace's approached them. "Hi, you must be Leo and Mr. Sinclair. I'm Chloe, Grace's sister." Her handshake was firm, her welcome genuine. "Grace is just finishing up with a little one. Make yourselves comfortable." Or as comfortable as one can be on a recycled tire stool, she added with a chuckle, gesturing to a colourful, if unconventional seating area. Edward found himself perched awkwardly on one such stool, feeling like a titan attempting to sit on a toadstool. He watched as Grace moved among the children, her presence calming, encouraging. She wasn't treating them. She was with them, laughing, with one gently adjusting a strap for another, mirroring the tentative movements of a third. He saw a side of her completely different from the composed waitress or the quietly defiant woman in his office. Here she was, a natural force, a quiet sun around whom these small planets joyfully orbited. Leo, after a moment of shy observation, was drawn towards a group attempting to create a synchronized wiggle. Edward watched him, a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He almost intervened when Leo stumbled, but Chloe, sensing his tension, laid a light hand on his arm. "He's okay, Mr. Sinclair. Falling is just part of finding your balance here." Trying to appear nonchalant, Edward wandered over to a table laden with art supplies, a riot of paint, glitter, and recycled materials. His instinct was to neaten the apparent jumble, perhaps arrange the crayons by color spectrum. He'd just reached for a stray blue when a small girl with pigtails and determined eyes looked up at him. "Are you going to help mess it up? Mr. Messing It Up is the best part for making new things." Chloe, passing by, winked at him over the girl's head. Leo, meanwhile, had forgotten his father's presence. He was giggling, attempting a particularly complex wiggle, his face flushed with exertion and happiness, and then a playful tease. "Dad," he called out, his voice bright, "you look like you're about to conduct a very serious business meeting, not watch us have fun." Edward almost smiled. Almost. It was then that another woman entered the main space, her presence commanding an immediate, quiet respect. She was older, with elegantly braided silver hair and an aura of keen intelligence. She greeted several children by name before her eyes landed on Edward. They narrowed slightly. "Mr. Sinclair?" she said, her voice carrying a note of dry surprise. "I must say, this is an unexpected pleasure. Or perhaps, more accurately, just unexpected." Chloe, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, quickly made the introductions. "Mr. Sinclair, this is Dr. Vivian Holloway." "Dr. Holloway, Edward Sinclair and his son, Leo. Dr. Vivian Holloway." The name resonated with Edward, a vague memory stirring. He extended a hand. "Dr. Holloway, I feel we might have." Corresponded, Dr. Holloway's handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "Indeed, Mr. Sinclair, or rather my research proposals corresponded with your foundation, 3 times over the past 2 years, if memory serves. Each time, regrettably, without success." The air crackled. Edward felt a sudden prickling unease. He looked from Dr. Holloway to Grace, who had joined them, her expression calm but watchful. Research proposals, Edward repeated, his mind racing. For a pilot program exploring non-directive approaches to motor rehabilitation in children with motor challenges. Dr. Holloway stated her tone level, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. A program based on the theory of movement autonomy, integrating adaptive dance with neuroscientific principles. The very program, in fact, that you are witnessing here at Freedom Steps. The penny didn't just drop, it crashed through the floor. Edward stared at Grace, a dawning, uncomfortable understanding beginning to form. You work as a waitress," he said, the statement now sounding utterly inadequate, almost foolish. Freedom Steps doesn't yet have adequate funding for full-time salaries, Mr. Sinclair. Grace explained, her voice still quiet, but now with an edge of undeniable challenge, especially when pioneering research proposals are repeatedly overlooked. Dr. Holloway nodded. "Ms. Evans is not merely an assistant on those proposals, Mr. Sinclair. She is the co-author. Her theoretical work on the correlation between self-directed movement and neural reconfiguration, despite her incomplete master's, a situation necessitated by family responsibilities, is quite frankly groundbreaking." Groundbreaking. The word hung in the air, heavy and resonant. Edward looked at Grace Evans, the waitress, the tutor, the bookstore clerk, and for the first time he began to see the extraordinary woman hidden beneath the ordinary, everyday disguises. The woman whose intellect and passion his own multi-billion-dollar foundation had dismissed not once, but 3 times. The full weight of his misjudgment, his arrogant, blind dismissal, hit him with the force of a physical blow. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Dr. Holloway's words, each one meticulously chosen, landed like hammer blows against the fortress of Edward Sinclair's ego. Groundbreaking. Co-author. His own foundation's repeated dismissals. He looked at Grace Evans, truly seeing her now, not as a waitress, but as a quiet force, a brilliant mind obscured by the daily grind of survival. The shame was a bitter, unfamiliar taste in his mouth. You knew he stated his voice, flat devoid of its usual authority. At the restaurant, you knew who I was. Grace met his gaze, her own unwavering. Yes, Mr. Sinclair, I knew. Your company's annual reports, your foundation's public filings, they are not state secrets. There was no triumph in her voice, no accusation, merely a statement of fact. Then a flicker of something vulnerable crossed her face, a hint of the ethical tightrope she must have walked. When Leo asked me to dance, it felt like an opportunity. A desperate one, perhaps. After all other avenues to present our work had been exhausted, after the doors to foundations like yours remained so firmly closed, I knew I had to find another way to make you see. Edward wanted to rage. He wanted to accuse her of manipulation of an elaborate, deceitful charade. The words formed in his mind, sharp and cutting. You used my son. But as he looked at her, at the quiet integrity that radiated from her, at the weary lines around her eyes that spoke of battles fought and hardships endured, the anger deflated, leaving behind a hollow ache. An internal voice, one that sounded disconcertingly like Eleanor's, whispered, "And what other choice did your arrogance leave her, Edward?" It was at that precise moment, as Edward wrestled with this discomforting new self-awareness, that the main doors of Freedom Steps opened again. This time, however, it wasn't a parent or another child. It was a small group of people, a few with cameras, others with notepads, the unmistakable insignia of the press. Edward tensed instantly. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice regaining some of its old sharpness, his eyes darting towards Grace, then Dr. Holloway. "Is this some kind of setup?" Dr. Holloway stepped forward, calm and resolute. "Mr. Sinclair, today, my research partner, Ms. Evans, and I published our preliminary findings on the Movement Autonomy Protocol, the core of Freedom Steps. We felt the work was too important to remain hidden any longer, regardless of funding. We invited a few select members of the press to witness the program in action. She held up a tablet displaying an online journal article, Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation, Methodology Shows Promising Results in Children with Physical Disabilities. His mind reeled. A setup, yes, but one born of desperation and a fierce belief in their work. A work he had dismissed without a second thought. He felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of profound, sickening shame. He had been played, yes, but he was also realizing with horrifying clarity that he had been the fool. You used my son for a public relations stunt. He bit out the accusation, tasting like ash in his mouth. Grace's gaze didn't waver. We used an opportunity, Mr. Sinclair. An opportunity that arose because Leo, in his own brave way, reached out. Everything that happened in that restaurant was genuine. Leo's desire to dance my acceptance, that was real. She gestured around the vibrant room, at the children moving with varying degrees of freedom and joy. This is real. The only thing orchestrated here today, Mr. Sinclair, was the desperate hope that someone with the power to make a difference might finally open their eyes and see the potential that is routinely ignored. She then led him almost gently to a quiet corner of the room, away from the curious eyes of the reporters who were now beginning to notice the billionaire in their midst. One wall was covered with photographs, dozens of children, each with a handwritten note detailing their progress, their small victories. On the far end was a large, empty picture frame. "What's that?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse. "Our future, Mr. Sinclair," Grace said softly. "The full rehabilitation center we dream of building. A place that could help 500 children a year, not just 50. A place that your foundation could have helped build years ago had you chosen to read beyond the first page of our proposals." The words, though softly spoken, were a direct hit. He had orchestrated all this. He thought the dance, the meeting bringing me here on press day. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger at being maneuvered, shame at his own blindness, and a reluctant dawning admiration for this woman's tenacity, her unwavering commitment. 4 months ago, Grace continued, her voice still low, when your assistant, Miss Coleman, cancelled our scheduled meeting, a meeting we had waited 6 months for. Without so much as a cursory glance at our updated research, I promised myself I would find a way. Just as Edward was about to retort, a sudden commotion erupted from the center of the room. Chloe Evans rushed over, her eyes wide. "Grace, Edward, it's Leo." They hurried back. Leo stood in the middle of a small, hushed circle of children, and a few reporters whose cameras were now flashing insistently. Someone had turned off the music. Leo, his face, a mask of fierce concentration, had done something Edward had been told by a legion of specialists might take years if it ever happened at all. He had, with painstaking effort, unstrapped one of his leg braces. It lay on the floor beside him. He was attempting to balance on his own, on one leg, supported by its brace, the other, trembling but free. Leo Edward started forward, a cry of alarm tearing from his throat. "Be careful." Grace put a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly strong. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Leo, shining with an almost unbearable intensity. "Watch him, Edward. Just watch." Leo took a deep, shuddering breath. He swayed precariously. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to rush forward to catch him, to put the brace back on, to restore order, to control the uncontrollable. Then, to the utter astonishment of everyone present, most especially his father, Leo Sinclair lifted his unsupported foot. He wobbled his small body, a testament to sheer willpower. And then he took a step. A small, hesitant, achingly imperfect step. But it was a step taken utterly on his own. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by an eruption of spontaneous cheers from the other children. The camera flashes intensified, capturing the moment for posterity, or perhaps for the evening news. Edward stood frozen, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. He saw his son not as a collection of medical diagnoses and limitations, but as a warrior, a small, fierce hero claiming his own victory. The unshed tears that had threatened earlier now streamed freely, unheeded, down Edward Sinclair's face. He didn't even try to wipe them away. The iron mask he had worn for 2 long years had finally irrevocably cracked. "That's why we created Freedom Steps, Mr. Sinclair," Grace said softly beside him, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not about perfect steps. It's about those first terrifying, magnificent steps, taken on your own." He could only nod, incapable of speech, his gaze locked on his son, who, oblivious to the adult drama swirling around him, was now attempting another step, a radiant, triumphant smile illuminating his face. This Edward realized with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, was what true wealth looked like. Not the numbers in his bank accounts, not the towers that bore his name, but this precious, unbuyable moment of pure, unadulterated human triumph. The joyous cheers of the children, the excited babble of the reporters, the relentless flash of cameras. It all seemed to recede, a distant, muffled roar in Edward Sinclair's ears. He stood on the periphery of the celebration, a man adrift in a sea of his own making. His gaze was fixed on Leo, his son, who was now surrounded by an admiring knot of children, his face alight with a joy so pure, so radiant, it was like staring directly into the sun. Each shaky, triumphant step Leo took was a hammer blow against the icy walls Edward had so carefully constructed around his heart. "It's not about perfection, Edward. It's about connection." Eleanor's voice, a whisper from a past he had tried to embalm in amber, echoed with a startling, painful clarity. He saw her then not just as a cherished memory, but as a living presence, her eyes full of the gentle disappointment he had refused to see when she was alive. Disappointment in his obsession with control, his fear of vulnerability, his gradual retreat from the messy, unpredictable, beautiful reality of life. He had built an empire, commanded boardrooms, shaped markets. He was Edward Sinclair, a name synonymous with power, with unassailable success. Yet in this small, unassuming community center, surrounded by handmade posters and the vibrant, chaotic energy of children, his foundation had deemed unworthy of its attention. He felt an emptiness so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had provided Leo with everything money could buy: the best doctors, the most advanced therapies, a sterile, perfectly managed environment. Everything except what his son, and perhaps he himself, had needed most permission to be imperfect space, to be brave, and the simple, unadorned gift of human connection. Grace Evans, Dr. Vivian Holloway. These women, with their quiet dedication and groundbreaking work, had offered him a lifeline, a chance to invest in real human potential, and he had dismissed them 3 times. The thought was a fresh wave of shame, hot and suffocating. He remembered the crisp, dismissive memos from his foundation, the polite, sterile rejections drafted by underlings who echoed his own detached efficiency. He had built his world on a bedrock of calculated decisions, risk assessments, and bottom lines. There had been no room in his spreadsheets for the immeasurable value of a child's unaided step, for the quiet revolution sparked by a dance program in a rundown warehouse. He saw Miss Coleman's coolly efficient face in his mind's eye, cancelling that crucial meeting. He saw the endless parade of specialists who had offered prognoses, but no real hope, who had focused on Leo's limitations rather than his spirit. He saw his own reflection, a man so afraid of further pain, further loss, that he had inadvertently inflicted a different kind of wound on his own son, the wound of invisibility, of unacknowledged potential. The reporters were now beginning to edge closer their microphones like hungry birds, sensing a story far bigger than a community centre's funding struggles. Mr. Sinclair, what brings you to Freedom Steps today? Is it true your foundation previously denied funding to this program? What's your reaction to your son's incredible progress? Their questions were a barrage, but he barely heard them. He was watching Leo. His son, his brave, beautiful boy, was now attempting to show another smaller child in a wheelchair how to spin his earlier triumph, already translating into a desire to share, to uplift. That Edward realized with a jolt that went straight to his core was true leadership. Not commanding, not controlling, but inspiring, empowering, following. He felt Grace's quiet presence beside him. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze soft as she watched Leo. There was no "I told you so" in her posture, no hint of smug victory. Only a deep, unwavering belief that seemed to radiate from her like a gentle warmth. He had a choice. He could retreat, issue a curt no-comment summon Ms. Coleman to extract him from this uncomfortably real situation and return to the anodyne, predictable world of Sinclair Tower. He could dismiss this as an anomaly, a fluke, a moment of emotional weakness. Or he could do the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He could surrender. He could admit he was wrong. He could tear down the fortress stone by painful stone. Edward Sinclair took a deep breath. The cacophony of the room seemed to sharpen the faces around him, coming into focus. He saw the eager, expectant eyes of the reporters. He saw Dr. Holloway, her expression a mixture of hope and professional reserve. He saw Chloe Evans, her arms around a group of children, watching him with an open, questioning gaze. He saw Grace, her profile serene, her strength a quiet anchor in the storm of his emotions. And he saw Leo, his son, looking back at him, now his eyes shining not with accusation, but with a hesitant, hopeful invitation. An invitation to join him in this new, brighter world. Slowly, deliberately, Edward Sinclair turned to face the reporters. He felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness, as if a tremendous weight had begun to lift from his shoulders. The words came not from the calculating mind of the CEO, but from a place deeper, more honest, a place he hadn't visited in a very long time. "You ask what brings me here today," he began, his voice a little hoarse at first, then gaining strength, resonating through the suddenly silent room. "I came here to witness a miracle. Not just the miracle of my son Leo taking steps I was told he might never take." He paused, his gaze finding Leo, a genuine, unforced smile finally gracing his lips. But the miracle of programs like Freedom Steps, the miracle of dedicated, brilliant individuals like Ms. Grace Evans and Dr. Vivian Holloway, whose visionary work. He hesitated, the admission costing him, yet also liberating him. Whose visionary work, my own foundation, was too blind, too short-sighted to recognize. Until now. A stunned silence greeted his words. Grace's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise finally breaking through her composure. Dr. Holloway's professional mask softened, a slow smile dawning on her face. "It is a difficult thing," Edward continued, the words flowing more easily now, as if a dam had broken within him, "for a man in my position, for an institution like the Sinclair Foundation to admit when it has been profoundly wrong. He looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera, addressing not just the room, but the world, and perhaps the ghost of Eleanor. We were wrong. The admission hung in the air, stark and unequivocal. Then camera flashes exploded a fusillade of light. Therefore Edward Sinclair announced, his voice clear, resolute, the voice of a man finally stepping out of his own shadow. The Sinclair Foundation is pleased and deeply honored to announce a full, unconditional 5-year funding commitment to Freedom Steps. Furthermore, we will provide the capital to build the new, expanded rehabilitation center, envisioned by Ms. Evans and Dr. Holloway, a center that will help hundreds, perhaps thousands more children find their own freedom steps. Chloe Evans let out an audible gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. The children around her began to cheer, sensing the magnitude of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand the words. Edward raised a hand, a small smile playing on his lips. On one non-negotiable condition. He looked directly at Grace, then at Dr. Holloway, his eyes holding a newfound respect, a nascent humility. That Ms. Evans and Dr. Holloway retain complete, uncompromised autonomy over the program, its methodology and its future. No corporate interference, no bureaucratic meddling. Their vision, their expertise will lead the way. My foundation, we will simply be privileged to follow and to support. It was more than just a funding announcement. It was a testament, a surrender, a quiet, profound revolution in the heart of one Edward Sinclair billionaire father, and a man finally tentatively learning how to dance to a different, more human rhythm. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fresh paint and newly turned earth. Where the old dilapidated warehouse once stood, a new structure was rising. The Freedom Steps Center for Movement and Discovery. It wasn't the most ostentatious building the Sinclair Foundation had ever funded, certainly not by the standards of gleaming corporate towers, but to Edward Sinclair, it was by far the most beautiful. He stood on the bustling construction site, a hard hat slightly askew on his silvered hair, no longer an outside observer, but an integral, if sometimes endearingly awkward part of the process. He'd surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself. After his public declaration, many had expected him to simply write the checks and retreat to the familiar comfort of his financial empire. But Edward was a changed man. He attended board meetings for Freedom Steps, not as a distant benefactor, but as an engaged, often questioning student. He'd even, to Miss Coleman's initial bewilderment, requested a reading list from Dr. Vivian Holloway on neuroplasticity and pediatric adaptive movement. Mr. Sinclair, Dr. Holloway had remarked one afternoon, a rare twinkle in her usually serious eyes, as she found him poring over a particularly dense scientific journal in the site office, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside him. I must confess, I never envisioned synaptic pruning becoming part of your regular lexicon. Edward had looked up, rubbing his tired eyes, a smudge of drywall dust on his cheek. Neither did I, Doctor. Neither did I. Frankly, I'm still not entirely sure I can pronounce proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation correctly, especially after lunch. He'd said it with a wry, self-deprecating smile, a lightness that had been absent from him for years. Grace, who had walked in with Chloe to discuss the placement of the new sensory garden, had overheard and shared a soft smile with her sister. The old Edward Sinclair would never have admitted to such a trivial or human failing. His most significant efforts, however, were reserved for Leo. Their weekend visits to the temporary Freedom Steps location, now buzzing with new energy and more children than ever were sacrosanct. He no longer watched from the sidelines, a stern, anxious guardian. He participated, awkwardly at first. He'd once tried to optimize a game of tag by suggesting aerodynamic running paths, much to the children's giggling confusion, and Leo's mock-serious pronouncement, "Dad, it's tag, not a hostile takeover." But he was learning to let go of control, learning to embrace the joyful chaos, learning to simply be present with his son. Leo, in turn, was blossoming. The hesitant boy, who had once struggled to take a single unaided step, was now a whirlwind of determined energy. His braces were lighter, his movements more fluid. He still used a sleek carbon fiber cane on days when his muscles were particularly fatigued, a quiet reminder that challenges remained, that this wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a journey of continuous effort. But the fear that had once haunted his eyes was gone, replaced by a bright, unwavering confidence. One afternoon, while they were at the nearly completed new center, Edward found Leo teaching a younger girl, Lily, who was new to the program, and shyly clinging to her mother, a simple balancing exercise. Leo was patient, encouraging his explanations clear and kind. Edward watched his heart swelling with a pride so immense it almost ached. Later, as they walked through the sun-dappled frame of what would be the main dance studio, Leo had grinned up at him. "You know, Dad, you're getting pretty good at not looking like you're about to fire everyone when you're here." Edward had chuckled, ruffling Leo's hair. "High praise, son. High praise indeed." He then attempted a clumsy pirouette, a deliberate parody of a ballet move. Leo had collapsed into laughter. "Careful, Dad," he'd gasped between giggles. "Don't want you to pull a stock market." Their shared laughter echoed in the unfinished space, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The relationship between Edward and Grace had also evolved. The initial tension, the unspoken accusations had slowly given way to a profound, mutual respect. Grace never let him forget the power he wielded, nor the responsibility that came with it. But she also saw the genuine change in him, the sincere effort. "You know," she'd said to him one day, as they reviewed blueprints for an adaptive playground, "your foundation's support has been transformative." But Freedom Steps was always more than just a set of proposals, Mr. Sinclair. It was a promise. To children like Leo. To families who had been told no too many times. She paused, then met his gaze directly. "Your funding allows us to keep that promise on a scale we once only dreamed of. But Chloe and I and Dr. Holloway, we're also building other partnerships, small community grants, local business sponsors. This needs to be owned by everyone." Edward had nodded, understanding perfectly. It wasn't about his salvation of their program. It was about his participation in its already existing, deeply rooted value. "You taught me to follow, Grace," he said quietly, the words a more sincere apology than any he could have formally constructed. "And it's been the most important lesson of my life." The official opening of the Freedom Steps Center for Movement and Discovery was a day filled with sunshine and unrestrained joy. Children's laughter mixed with the upbeat rhythm of music. Miss Coleman was there no longer just an efficient assistant, but a genuinely moved observer, even seen attempting a tentative wiggle with Chloe Evans, whose witty commentary on the remarkable de-Sinclairification of Edward had become a running joke among the staff. Mr. Harrison was notably absent from any guest list. The highlight for many was a short performance led by Leo. With 3 other children from the program, their movements varied, but their spirits united. He led them through a simple, choreographed routine. His steps were not perfect, his balance still occasionally challenged by the light brace on one leg, but he moved with a grace and confidence that brought tears to many eyes. Edward watched from the side, no longer a king surveying his domain, but simply a father. A proud, deeply humbled father. Eleanor's absence was a familiar ache, a quiet note in the symphony of the day, but it was no longer a crippling void. It was a presence, a reminder of the love that had started him on this unexpected journey, the love that now found new expression in every joyful step his son took. A reporter, the same one who had eagerly questioned him months ago, approached him. "Mr. Sinclair, an incredible transformation for your son, and if I may say, for this community. What's been the biggest lesson you've learned?" Edward looked out at the children dancing at Grace and Dr. Holloway, beaming at Leo helping Lily find her rhythm. He thought of the sterile boardrooms, the relentless pursuit of profit, the gilded cage he had mistaken for a kingdom. He turned back to the reporter, a genuine reflective smile on his face. "That true wealth, Edward Sinclair," said his voice quiet but firm, "isn't found in what you control, but in what you connect with. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is have the courage to follow a child's dance." The music played on a vibrant, hopeful rhythm, and for the first time in a very long time, Edward Sinclair felt like he too was finally learning the steps to a life truly lived. The scars of the past remained a reminder of lessons hard-earned, but the future, like the joyful, uninhibited dance of the children before him, was filled with an boundless, extraordinary promise. Edward Sinclair's journey reminds us that life's biggest shifts can begin with the smallest steps: a child's courage, a stranger's grace. How often do we overlook the profound connections waiting just beneath the surface of our hurried lives? This story of an unexpected awakening deeply moved us, and we hope it resonated with you too. What do you believe was the true turning point for Edward's heart? Share your thoughts below. We also cherish your constructive feedback. If anything in today's story or our storytelling could be enhanced, please let us know in the comments. Your insights help us grow. If this journey touched you, please give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates stories of heartfelt transformation. For more narratives that explore the human spirit, do subscribe and ring the bell to join us on future emotional journeys. Thank you for listening. Find the extraordinary in your everyday.